currency. Splurging millions, buying houses like Monopoly. Fucking 9 to 5, man, the money is a joke to me. Buying cryptocurrency, my money in the privacy. I make it rain dollars, they watch me disappear. I'm so fly, man, I'ma need some land again.
Hey guys and girls, welcome to this week's episode of the B.Invested Birchy podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Birch, and this is the show unraveling the truth to the 21st century. We're now exiting the matrix and waking up to motherfucking reality. Today, I am really excited because I have another new special guest here. We've got Simon Kuestenmacher from the demographics group here today. So thanks a lot, Simon, for coming on the show with us.
It's great to be on.
Awesome, mate. Awesome. I guess it is really good to have you on board because a lot of my audience, we always talk about stats and figures and what's happening out there in the economy, what's happening out there in the world. And having you on board today, you can share with us a lot of like analytical data, real data that's out there about the world we live in. So maybe if you can give the audience a bit of background just on who you are and your business and what you do, and we'll get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the co-founder of a little group called the Demographics Group, and we do exactly that. We look at demographic data all day, every day, trying to understand how the world works, trying to understand in particular how Australia works. And we have a big future focus because demographics is really the closest thing we have to a crystal ball to understand the future, because certain demographic trends are just set in stone, really. So if we look ahead for the next 20, 30 years, we know exactly what the population will look like over 50, because migration doesn't really impact it. So if we look at the aging of the population, all the data that we have is spot on. If we look at the younger cohorts, the people that we migrate into this country, there is a bit of a discussion how these things might change or might not change in the future. But overall, we have a really clear understanding in Australia what the demographic setup will look like. And from this on, we can think about generational values, and we can think about how generational values will shift or shape Australia when a new generation enters a new stage of the life cycle, and so forth. And on top of this, we overlay all types of different data sets to make sense of the world. And then I present this at presentations and board meetings on stage. I write a weekly column for The Australian and for the New Daily. And that's about it. We do a bit of specialized consulting as well. If businesses have demographic emergencies, we're happy to help.
Awesome. Well, thanks. I'm really excited to hear what your thoughts are like, and I think the community will really benefit from it. Like just hearing a bit more about, the numbers. Like obviously my business B.Invested, we're a property firm, and a lot of people like knowing, what will happen to the, economy, what will happen in 20 years time when I go to retire. I'm buying assets now. How will it affect? We've got an aging population. We've got migrants moving to the country. I'd love to hear, just a bit about where you think Australia is heading and the world's heading. So.
Absolutely. So to anyone doing anything with property, do not retire before the end of the 2030s. The 2030s will be the wildest decade that you could possibly imagine, simply because Australia continues to grow. So there's lots of population growth, lots of movement there, but you also have the big fat baby boomer generation finally selling off their assets. They're selling off their assets for two reasons. They're either getting too old throughout the 2030s to live in their family home, so it becomes a nuisance to manage, a physical hazard even, so they sell down, or they do the ultimate downsizing where they die and are being carried out of their home. And that's happening at scale. So all of a sudden you have all those baby boomer homes, 3 and 4 bedrooms, dwellings in the most lucrative, attractive suburbs of the country entering the market at scale. Lots of movements. All this wealth is being shifted to the millennial generation, the kids of the baby boomers. Those guys and gals will be in their 50s by then. So they will use all the money that they inherit, either to sell off their mortgage or pay off their mortgage and potentially buy an investment property. That's all property, or they might upgrade the home. So really whatever happens with this big fat intergenerational wealth transfer would ultimately end up in the property market. That's how Australians operate. So the 2030s are going to be wild.
Awesome. And that I guess the flow-on effect would be there's a lot of liquidity coming into the market, because as people are, let's say someone with a baby boom, they've got a $2 million house, the child inherits it, they sell it off, someone will be going to the bank, attracting a loan, there will be new currency being generated into the system, someone will be taking that currency and spending it elsewhere, big liquidity.
Oh, exactly. This is why you have all this wealth that is sitting a bit dormant for another decade. That is then going to enter the market in all different shapes and forms, mostly property. But so Australia will get a bit of an economic boost just because all this money is then going to be utilized. So 2030s are going to be a good decade. The 2020s, we'll see. There's still lots of population growth in there. We'll still grow by well over 3 million people over the coming decade. So that means there's still huge demand for homes. It is super predictable where the property market is heading in terms of what type of housing is needed, because you have about 14, 15 years worth of millennials making babies left in the tank, meaning millennials will leave the hipster inner city suburbs behind, and they'll hunt for 3 and 4 bedroom homes. They will move to wherever those homes are available. These homes are not available in the cool inner city because there's just not the stock available. They can't move to the middle suburbs because their baby boomer parents are still hogging the 3 and 4 bedroom homes. They're not downsizing just yet. So you have millennials move to the urban fringe, even to all those regional centers within driving distance to the big CBD in the capital city. That's predictable, what's happening over the next 15 years. So if you have 3 or 4 bedroom homes on offer, there will be a market.
Awesome. And what about like downsizing, if we're getting to the other side of things, like entry point sort of homes for people? Because obviously the cost of inflation out there is pretty strong. The cost of everything's rising at the moment. So I find a lot of people can't afford $1 million, $2 million property. The thing where I sort of specialize in and look at is, the stuff where you could get in for 200 grand, 300 grand. A lot of people can afford that sort of end price range. Do you have any data around that, Simon?
In terms of so downsizing, if you look at the traditional downsizing, which is just baby boom or old people figuring out that their big house is too big, they might as well cash in and buy a smaller property. That narrative is a bit exaggerated. Australians really will tell you stuff like, I want to be carried out of my family house. So of course there is still, because we are an ever-growing population and there are more and more old people, so you'll have an increased number of people downsizing. But is it a mass phenomenon? No. Will the traditional downsizing destinations benefit? Absolutely. So your Noosa, your Gold Coast, all those locations will see stronger demand than ever before. But ultimately don't expect all that much stock in relative terms to come online, because the goal is to stay living independently in your family home. And more baby boomers will not really retire. They will still stay connected to the workforce in some way or form, because they, to a larger degree, have knowledge jobs that can be done remotely via a laptop, that can be done until old age. You can't be a brickie until your late 70s, but you can easily continue to do a bit of consulting work for your knowledge work employer until your 70s.
True. And I guess that's a skill for young people looking at what career do I get into. The body fails as you get older, laying bricks every day. So, cool. And you mentioned about 3 million people coming into the country. Is that via migration?
Yeah. So as a rule of thumb in Australia, we say about 2/3 of our population growth comes from migration and 1/3 comes from natural increase, which just means more babies are being born than people die on the other end. And so we are traditionally a high migration nation. The pandemic threw a bit of a spanner in the works there. So we had, instead of adding 200,000 people, net new migrants in the first year of the pandemic, we lost 90,000 people or thereabouts. So that is forever an imbalance. And this is part of the skills shortage that everyone is talking about. When you say, we can't find a tradie to do our renovation or anything like this. Part of this is the pandemic. It's just we lost temporary migrants to overseas, and they did not return. And even now, if we amp up migration, it'll be hard to fill this hole. But the skills shortage is also baked into the demographic setup of Australia. You have the old baby boomer generation retiring. That was a big generation retiring. And you have a small generation enter the workforce at the other end of the spectrum. So that means there's a bit of a mismatch here. And as if this wasn't bad enough, you have the biggest generation, the millennials, making babies now and taking at least a bit of time off work. Even though particular millennial women return to the workforce at record pace and at record capacity, there's still so many millennials, and men are increasingly leaving the workforce too for a couple of months. That all adds to the skills shortage. So the skills shortage, the skills squeeze will be with us for another decade or so, until you then only have a small cohort retiring and a relatively big cohort entering the workforce. Then things will ease up. But the next decade, you won't find workers. So you need to be really switched on in terms of how do you look after, your old population. The care workforce will be particularly difficult to staff in the next decade because we need lots of low-income workers. Care workers are low-income workers, and we need them to live close to the demand. These are the high-income retirees. And why the hell would you work in aged care? Low paid, you can't live near your work because those suburbs are utterly unaffordable, and you probably find work that pays just as well closer to home. So I'm not all that optimistic about the future of aged care. We really need to revamp the system, and all those middle suburbs where the baby boomers are currently living as empty nesters and are big fat NIMBYs. They block development as they can. That will probably need to be undone in order to just make sure that they have enough carers living closely. That's an issue I'm really nervous about.
Yeah, and I've got a few other questions, Simon. Like as you're saying that, like as these people are moving on, they're moving to smaller places, downsizing, more migration coming in. Like my view, just over the 37 years of being alive, is when you look at capital cities like Sydney, I think would be the doormat to the country. People migrate to Sydney and then move out to different places. Is there a trend that's driving where people are moving to? Like, are they moving more regional? Are they is there any statistics around that? Like, you said about the Gold Coast beforehand, it's obvious that Southeast Queensland, but is there any other specifics or?
So when we talk about the geographic big picture trends, what the pandemic did and what the demographic setup did is that the existing population of Australia, the millennials, are increasingly leaving the inner city to find 3 and 4 bedroom homes. So that shifts them out. That just dictates that the inner city gets vacated by them in order to look for family-sized homes. They are not even all that available in the middle suburbs. So millennials move to the urban fringe. They move to regional Australia because the home is the most important driver. Also, the working from home phenomenon in Australia dictated, it forced all kinds of bosses to trust their workers enough to work remotely. So then people figured, hey, if I can work remotely and I'm not going to the office, why am I paying a premium to live close to the office tower? So that also pushed people a bit further out. So these were the drivers that pushed people to the fringe. But if we look at the new population that we migrate into the country, where will they live? A migrant that comes to Australia, as you mentioned, comes through what we call launchpad suburbs. So Sydney always sees the biggest migration because if you move to Australia, you know absolutely nothing about the place. Sydney, the Harbour Bridge, the Opera House, and if you're Indian and you like cricket, you know the MCG. And that's about what people know about the country. And so they move close to that. And skilled migrants and international students, they know one address in the country. That's either the university or the office. So they move as close as possible to that address as they can. That will then ultimately fill up the inner city, the inner suburbs again, because we are inching towards record migrant numbers this year. So we'll see whether we actually reach them. But there is strong demand for that. So we know that all the migration into the country will move to central destinations, so they will fill up massively. One structural issue that we have in Australia is that our migration policy is not linked to our housing policy. So you just import more people because the treasurer likes having more people because it gives them more GDP to throw around into infrastructure projects and stuff like this. And that's naive, though, because you grow your population base at a faster rate than you add. Makes it a great investment, if you will. But from a perspective, that is a nightmare that I'm really hoping gets fixed, is that you have a stricter housing quota based on your migration intake.
Yeah, awesome. And you mentioned that we're at a higher sort of level of migration. Like, what sort of migration are we seeing at the moment, and what would we typically see, and what do you think that would be moving forward? If you had to guess, and I guess, yeah, it's a guess. So.
Yeah. So in the decade before the pandemic, we took a very 180,000, 200,000 net new migrants per year. So it means we got more people from overseas than we lost overseas, because international students, they stay for a bit and then they go back. So the actual inflow and outflow numbers are much, much higher. But we grew the country by, let's call it 1,000 people pre-pandemic. The biggest year we ever saw was 308,000 people in 2008, which is when I came to.
Okay.
So that was the biggest number. And we're now... The official target that's written in the budget is 235,000 people for the next 5 years, but we'll probably be well above that for this year. So we don't have official numbers, but that's, when you read between the lines, what we have so far, we'd probably inch closer towards 250, 280, something like this.
Fantastic. I guess they all need a roof over their head, they need somewhere to go, affordability, inflation.
Exactly. And so when we talk about migrants, it's pretty clear who's coming into the country. So migrants are of what we call migrant age population. Well over 80% of all migrants are 18 to 39 years of age, because they're either international students, 18 to 24. So you get a lower cost worker and they pay tax for a longer period of time. And remember, we put a gun to everybody's head and say you have to put 10% of your money into a superannuation. So all those migrants will pay for their own retirement. So they are financially a lucrative deal, because the first 22, 25 years of their life was for free. Remember that. If you grow an Australian baby, they are very expensive. The birth costs the state money, childcare, school, university, all those sicknesses in between, they cost the state money. In the terms, in the case of migrants, some sucker of a country pays for those very expensive first 20 years, and then Australia just gets a ready-baked taxpayer. So financially speaking, the migration scheme that we have is almost too good to be true.
So we need, I always joke about this with the community, is that we need more, like, we're all tax slaves. Like, we're all tied to the government. We're going to go work, we're going to go pay tax and all those sort of things. And it's, I find it interesting that you're saying the same sort of thing from what you're seeing from the stats, that we're getting people that can pay tax. We need more taxpayers here to boost our economy, to keep our system alive, which is very, very interesting. So.
Yeah, and that's the systemic issue of an aging population, is the more you age, the more expensive it gets, because it is just expensive to grow old. And it's also labor intensive to grow old as a nation, because just by being old, you need more care workers. Care workers don't create all that much GDP. They just keep people healthy and well. And ensure that everybody has dignity in old age. But economically speaking, it just means we bind a big chunk of the workforce. And so how do you grow the economy? It's difficult. So the easiest way is to amp up migration, to keep track with this, to keep up with the pace. That's fair enough. And we can do this probably for a long time, because ultimately we don't grow the country by all that much. 300, 400,000 people per year. We can do this for a while. Australia can easily have 2 times, 3 times the population. Assuming we get water management right. So that's how we work as a nation, just to make sure that it continues to work. It's not an easy challenge, but the alternative is much harder, because then dignity in old age falls apart. The whole idea that somebody would be paying, or young people would be willing to pay taxes for the old people, the whole intergenerational contract would completely fall apart. And the good news in Australia is that we were about 30 years ago wise enough to introduce superannuation. Superannuation is a good financial scheme, but it is also a scheme that holds society together. Because in the absence of superannuation, you will be facing an issue what Germany is facing right now and will be facing into the future. In Germany, you don't own your own superannuation bucket. There is one big bucket, and once again, there's a gun to your head. Everybody puts money into the bucket, but ultimately, it's one bucket. And there are formulas that dictate how much money you put in, how much money you get out, but these are not set in stone. They can be changed. So sooner or later, there will be, because Germany is aging even more than Australia, there will be a treasurer that says we need to freeze pensions. We can't increase them. We need to stop the indexing. We might to shrink them, because otherwise the whole system falls apart. And what will happen then, politically speaking, is that some political charlatan offers people to pay them full pensions, and that will be leading to a radicalization of the political system. So our superannuation scheme avoids this dilemma and really provides political stability, which is a godsend, because you don't want political instability on top of economic issues. If you combine those two, bad things can happen, and Australia is at least reasonably safeguarded for this development.
I think it's important, like you mentioned there, like 10% for the super funds. A lot of people don't realise, the importance of that, as well as, a lot of people turning 65 and then having to use their super fund. I think what we talk about so much with our channel and what we do is being able to bring that forward as well. So, you're 65 when you can access your super fund, but what about if you can build wealth outside of that super fund and being able to invest it, when you're 30, when you're 20, whilst you don't have all those expenses, the kids, family, and all those sorts of things. So, yeah.
Yeah, so you want to remember that the super, why we have super. We want to make sure that you pay for your own retirement. That's what we want as a society. And now it gets a bit misused as a vehicle to store lots and lots of wealth in. There's no reason from a societal perspective, from an individual perspective, there is that anybody should have more than $1 million, $1.5 million in their super, because we just want to make sure that you pay for your own retirement. We want to make sure that you don't use the pension system. That's all this is for. Other than this, as a state, you want to capture as much wealth as you can. So even any kind of tax benefit that you get from super over a certain limit is utterly useless for society. It's great for all the individuals that fall into this bracket, but so I would expect more and more super reform to cut this back to size. Because remember, so far we haven't seen super actually work, in a sense that we have not had people that paid super for their whole careers. That'll be in the 2030s. You'll have the first person retire who paid super from their first day of work on. So this is still a system that is being developed. So be aware that whatever you put into your super might well be changed. Don't think those policies are set in stone. There will be lots of screaming and crying if people say, I have to pay 30% on all my super gains over $3 million or whatever it is. That'll come sure as hell. So don't expect, don't be surprised at the very least. Be annoyed if you fall into this category. But remember, the state has no interest in giving you more than ensuring that you do not rely on the pension.
Exactly. And I always say it's important. No one has a more vested interest in your well-being than yourself. And, the system is designed there. You need to take care of yourself and be able to provide for yourself. And a lot of people rely. And if we look at the US at the moment, the amount of debt, like it's 31. Last time I saw it was 20 trillion, then it went 30 trillion, 31 trillion, now it's 31.6 trillion. I think when I looked at it about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, it was 31 trillion. Now it's surprisingly got $31.6 trillion. So it's like $600 billion just thrown in there. It's like...
Yeah. And this is when money, I'm not an economist, I'm a demographer. This is when money just becomes, what's the difference between 21 trillion and 42 trillion? Who knows? Just all sounds an awful lot. So just psychologically speaking, it's very hard to understand. It's twice as much, probably has some sort of impact, but you don't care. After a certain number, you just, whatever. It's the same when we listen to figures about the war in Ukraine. 100,000 people die, 10,000 people die. It makes the world of a difference, but we don't care. We don't compute. It just means a lot. And that's where our little human capacity struggles. And that's where it's really important to roll back all your emotional responses and just look at numbers and go, okay, whatever we can do to drive down debt, to make sure that, fewer people die, to minimize harm. It doesn't sound attractive to the human brain because we can't make sense of it, but it makes all the world of a difference.
Exactly. The numbers don't lie. The numbers are out there. The numbers are happening. The data is out there, whether it's economic data, whether it's population data, whether it's the data all out there. And especially in a world today, I'm very optimistic. I don't know if you have much to say around like where you see inflation going or the numbers based on that. Do you have any data around that you could share?
Well, so I wouldn't really comment about where exactly will inflation be. I would just be parroting what I hear from people that I trust. But ultimately, you want to ask yourself: are you confident in the future of Australia?
Yeah.
And I would say there's absolutely no reason to be pessimistic. Ultimately, the business model under which Australia operates will continue to be attractive. We dig stuff out of the ground, we grow stuff on top of the ground, we sell this to the world, we entertain a couple of people by being a tourist destination, and we educate a couple of people by having universities sell education. That's it. And will there be a demand for this? Absolutely. Now that we transition towards green energies, all of a sudden, and renewable batteries and so forth, all of a sudden we need an absolute bucket load of new minerals, of new mining products. We have this on offer. The Northern Territory, small, geographically big, but small population code, all of a sudden they built a lithium mine. That makes a big difference. All of a sudden we have that thing on offer in the NT and so forth. That'll boom. It's a challenge for Australia will be to capture enough of this wealth locally that we create, and we can do so. That will be a bit of an uphill battle, but ultimately that's a good spot. We are a stable democracy. That's pretty nice. So all those basics work in our favor. We then just need to make sure that we get a couple of issues right. Water management is always one thing in Australia that we could screw up. Hopefully we won't. Urban planning, every now and then we should remind ourselves to not build horrendous suburbs where Western Sydney becomes, parts of Western Sydney become a bit of a heat island. That needs to be stopped. But that has to do with the way that property works in Australia, that we ended up with in New York City in the CBDs, big fat towers, and then immediately you go to suburbia. And then because we had cheap cars, we had open land, we just built a big fat pancake city. Berlin, for example, is 7 times smaller than Melbourne in terms of footprint. So it's tiny. But in Europe, we consider this a massive city. So there's an issue of densification, but we can't densify Australia because we miss the middle. The missing middle is the idea that we don't have, a couple of kilometers worth of 3 or 4 story medium density dwellings around our CBD. That'd be nice. That would really push densification. It would actually allow us to open up more green space. It would make housing more affordable, cities more walkable, which would be good for our high levels of obesity in this country. All these things would be wonderful, but you can't do it. To build a Euro block, one of those big fat blocks that you see when you visualize Paris, London, Berlin, how many quarter-acre blocks would you need to buy up to build this? You would do this over decades until you collect them. And after you bound up that much capital, you might as well build a big fat tower rather than a medium density dwelling. So we won't get there. So we risk of either building little townhouses left, right, and center that'll, they'll seal up soil, so we don't have all that much open space anymore, or we just live in 19-story towers next to the train station. So it's a bit of a problem how we densify our cities. It's quite hard. One way would be to say, well, if we over the next 50, 60 years double our population in this country, which is well possible, how would you want to do this? And you'd then say, well, maybe we need to build up secondary cities in a bigger sense. So a Geelong wouldn't double in size, a Geelong would triple in size. And you would then say, all of a sudden there you have a better chance of adding medium density developments on a greenfield site, which might feel a bit odd now, but it would ultimately be eaten up into the larger urban context, and it would then make sense. But that would mean you need to have urban planning policies in place right now that look 20, 30 years into the future. Would be nice to see them.
Yeah, that's interesting. When I think about it, I've never measured it, but I've seen little Instagram pictures and stuff like that. Like Australia's footprint would fit over the size of America footprint type of thing. So we've got a lot of space and we've got very little people and we've got so many commodities. It makes it an attractive option for people to want to migrate here. We've got beaches, weather, water surrounding us. It's just how do we get there and how big can it get? And I don't know what America's population, I think, is like 350 million or something. That's
exactly. Roughly speaking, you say America has somewhere between 13 or 15 times as many people, and they live on the same footprint. That's the rough comparison. And of course, in Australia, we will be hugging the coasts mostly. If you want to find the jackpot destinations inland, just look at the quality of the regional airport. The better the regional airport, the better the growth prospects. If you're lazy, you want to do no research, just Google the airport pictures and figure out how nice that airport is. And that'll be the future growth trajectory of this inland destination. All the other inland destinations that are just purely agricultural, how much do we need to grow them? These are functional towns. People move there because they are needed as workers there. They don't move there for lifestyle reasons all that much. And we'll probably need fewer agricultural workers in the future than now, because as mom and dad die or we retire and can't continue to do the farm work anymore, the kids are probably not taking over the farm. So this leads to farm aggregation. So we're aggregating farms. They can ultimately operate the land more efficiently, higher yields with fewer workers. Ultimately. And so that means the regional towns, agtech towns, are at the risk of shrinking unless they really manage to convince a couple of industries to settle there. Growing a regional agtech town is a big challenge. It helps everyone if they do so. Might be a more attractive town for many low-income workers to live in than a capital city. I'm always, semi-jokingly arguing that as a low-income worker, you should not live in Sydney or Melbourne. You should move to a regional town. You should flee the city because you can get a better lifestyle. You can get more bang for your buck there because housing is cheaper.
It's and I noticed, like you said about the airports in regional areas. Like I noticed that there's like inland rail that connects like Melbourne through New South Wales up to Brisbane now. Like, what are your thoughts on these?
Of course, airports, rail lines, think about it in connectivity. So you want to say, you then want to have an opinion about how this rail line is going to be developed into the future, how it is going to be serviced. But the idea here is connectivity to major centers. And a regional town, of course, a Dubbo is really far away from everything, but it has a marvelous small regional airport. So it is actually incredibly well connected. So you can live a Dubbo lifestyle, but zoom to Melbourne or Sydney in no time with a regional jet. So that's pretty nice. That's a good Ballina, probably an even better regional airport. So these things, they will ultimately drive population growth. So keep an eye out on those when you hunt for investments.
Fantastic. And you mentioned about the lithium mining and the mining. Like naturally, like people always joke about, you can go and buy something from China, make our cheap electronics and stuff like that. But I find it funny that we have to, in Australia, we're the ones that are pulling all this stuff out of the ground, and we send it over, like the best quality steel. We take our iron ore out of the ground, we send it over to China, we're getting it shipped back to us as, bits of material. What do you see the demand, and how do you feel like the commodities market and us being placed with so much stuff in the ground, how do you see that in the next decade, 2 decades, whatnot?
Well, so from a big fat demographic perspective, commodity prices should go up because there's more demand. The world will still grow for human population will still grow for another 40 to 60 years, depending on who you listen to. So that means more demand for absolutely everything. We'll get richer as a planet easily for another 100 plus years. So within our whole lifetime, everybody who's listening lifetime, we will be getting richer as a nation. That means that we will urbanize, or that means you'll need steel to build those cities, to build cars, to build all those things that we will be needing. And that's what we offer. As the world keeps growing, remember that Australia is one of, I think it's 7 countries that export food and energy. So we have enough energy and food to look after our population and to export the vast majority. That is pretty rare. A country like China doesn't have this. China imports food and energy. So when you then have some sort of opinion about the future relations between China and Australia, remember that China needs us much more than we need China. Since we only get money, boohoo, from China, but China gets food and energy from us. If China was ever going to be put under Russian-style sanctions, you would have 100+ million people die within a year or two. That's not fun. These are outrageous numbers. So China really benefits from being part of a globalized system, which is, of course, why they create all those trade links with the One Road initiative, One Belt, One Road initiative. And we are part of this.
Yeah.
So I'm rather confident about those geopolitical trends, meaning this is going back to mining prices. Commodity prices will be high because there will be a market for it. China will never, ever attack us and take our manganese and zinc by force. It's just cheaper to buy it. And so even if the US and China were in a bit of a trade war, the sea lines would be open and we could ship stuff to China. I'd be really surprised if anything would ever go wrong there.
You mentioned about those regional towns that are sort of around agriculture and that may shrink. Some of the larger ones could increase with migration there. What do you think about large regional areas that have mining attached to them, such as a big port, or they can ship out? See that there's some big port projects and infrastructure projects that are growing. What do you have any?
So market logic would dictate that we dig more stuff out of the ground, which means we need to transport more stuff to the ports, and then we need more little shippies that put our stuff into the harbor of a client. That's essentially so demand should go up for all of those things easily for another couple of decades. And the real tragedy would be if Australia wasn't able to capture the wealth that this mining boom creates. So you want to capture as much of this mining wealth locally. It doesn't feel like we're doing this because mining directly only creates 250,000 jobs in Australia. So it's not all that much. There's 13.5 million jobs in Australia, and just 250,000 fall into the mining category. So we need to make sure, and we need to be very bold in capturing this wealth. That's it. And the big issue that we have is unaffordable housing, because you can make, as an investor, you can make a nice buck with housing. That's true. But as a society, the risk is that we get hooked on empty calories, because you've seen all those statistics. Australia is the richest country in the world on a per capita basis. But that's just statistical bullshit, because it means your superannuation belongs to you.
Yeah.
So your retirement money belongs to you. That's captured in your wealth. It's not in a country like Germany, where there is this one big bucket. Also, your house is captured in your wealth, and they're just inflated. Whether your house is worth $1 million or $2 million, it's the same house. You're not actually utilizing this money. So how rich are you? And that stuff is not mirrored in those statistics. So don't listen to those stats that say Australia is the richest country on the planet. We are a rich country. We're doing well, absolutely. But there's no way we are richer than Switzerland or Norway. That's dumb to claim.
I think it's a belief system that everybody believes into the currency that we use, and the currency, like you have one house in 50 years' time, there's still one house. You have one bit of 1 ounce of gold in the ground, there's still 1 ounce of gold in the future. Whatever happens to the currency between now and then, it's just a reduction of the purchasing power in the currency. So people might feel rich. House has gone up to $2 million, but a Big Mac meal's gone up and doubled. Everything else has doubled throughout their lives. So
exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. And do you have any, I guess, tips for people or anything that you could share? Like you shared a lot. Like I actually really enjoyed us having a chat today, Simon. So yeah, it's, do you have anything else that you could share with people or any thoughts?
Well, so I guess in terms of when you make your investment decisions, when you try to understand the world and analyze data, just to keep yourself grounded, I always ask myself, am I doing justice to the complexity of the situation in my analysis? And if the answer is ever yes, I know that I'm wrong, because you can never, ever do justice to the complexity of this very, very difficult, interconnected world that we are living in. We can only ever come close to it. So you always know that your analysis is faulty, that your view of the world, and I mean, it's literally your worldview, the way that you perceive reality is always imperfect. And so you always want to keep this element of doubt into your own opinion there. That means, or it doesn't mean that you should be, disencouraged by this. You should still be bold, and you should constantly try to add another perspective through which you can view the world, because I honestly believe that if you view the world from a larger number of angles, you get a fuller picture of the world, and ultimately you can act in a more correct, more complex, smarter way, and ultimately the world will be better off if we are becoming more complex thinkers. And that's what I focus on. I'm trying to tell people about the demographic perspective. That's the thing I specialize on. And I think if more people have at least a tiny look at their universe through the demographic lens, their viewpoint gets a bit more complex.
Yeah. Critical thinking. A lot of people obey without questioning, and they don't question things and have critical thinking today, which is very, very important as well, like looking at things from every vantage point. So, yeah. Awesome, Simon. Well, I think I've got a lot out of today, right? I've got a lot out of just listening from your knowledge, your research, and what you do, and I really appreciate your time on the show today. If people wanted to connect with you or find out more about what you do or follow you, how would we go about that?
Well, the easiest way is to jump on my LinkedIn. It's actually not the easiest way, because you have to type in my very annoying and very German last name. So that'll be an absolute challenge only for the bravest of listeners out there. Other than that, I'm on Twitter. I have a very, very active Twitter feed where I share maps and data to 250,000 people every day. And that's Simon German 600 is the Twitter handle. That's a bit easier to type.
What I'll do, I'll put some of your links in here so people want to follow. Like, there's a fascinating data. Like, I'm all about finding that data. Like, always look at analytical. Like, I analyze the data from. I want to know what every country is doing, right? I'm constantly looking at financials from every country. I'm looking at the liquidity from the central banks. I'm looking at if they're injecting liquidity, if they're taking liquidity out, what's that going to affect on. And I think it's very important. And you have another element of that I haven't gone down that rabbit hole to that extent. I look at it from a high level, but, you're on the ground. It's really great. And I think a lot of people would get a lot of value out of that. So I'll be sure to share all that around. So
fantastic.
Fantastic, Simon. Well, I appreciate your time today on the show, and thanks a lot for everyone for listening. If you like today's episode, please share it with your friends and family, tag them in here, and make sure to tune into us every Thursday. You can find us on Apple Play, Google Play, Spotify, and YouTube. We'll catch up soon. Keep being awesome. Bye for now.
Yeah, Like Bilal said, man, we stuck in the matrix. This my advice, don't care if you take it. The dollar about to die, soon to be hyperinflated. This my 2 cents, don't care if you save it. Joint be decentralized and you will see you been lied to the whole time, and it's the irony, cause they do the exact opposite. You become a slave to the system, enough your money, all they do is profit. There's no conspiracy theory, you better hear me. Crypto will set you free before the system does. I don't care if you do or you don't, but what I'm saying is the truth to the reason you choke. I never been a failure, excuse my behavior. Keep talking, haters doing me a favor. They all tell lies, I know what they been telling you. I'm the opposite, the Donald Trump of Australia. It's amazing, here for the taking. My time is never wasted, just getting wasted.